This video is on ecosystems. An ecosystem is all of the biotic, which means living, and abiotic, which is light, water, and nutrients, factors in a given area. A population is one species living in one area, like all the grizzly bears in Montana. A community is all the organisms living in one area, all organisms in Montana. And the biosphere is the global ecosystem. The biosphere is the global ecological system integrating all living beings, including their interaction with the elements of the lithosphere, geosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms in conjunction with the non-living components of their environment. A community is a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common. And a population is all the inhabitants of a particular town, area, or country. You need to be familiar with producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Plants are called producers. This is because they produce their own food. They do this by using light energy from the sun, carbon dioxide from the air, and water from the soil to produce food in the form of glucose and sugar. Primary consumers are animals that eat primary producers. They are also called herbivores, which are plant eaters. Secondary consumers can be classified into one of two groups: carnivores, or meat eaters, and omnivores, which are plant and meat eaters. A tertiary consumer is a carnivore at the topmost level in a food chain that feeds on other carnivores, an animal that feeds only on secondary consumers. The terrestrial food chain goes grass, grasshopper, frog, hawk. This means that grass is the producer, grasshopper is the primary consumer, frog is the secondary consumer, and hawk is the tertiary consumer. A snake eating a rabbit is an example of a secondary consumer. An organism that eats autotrophs, such as a rabbit eating grass, is a primary consumer. A quaternary consumer is the top consumer in the food chain, as we said earlier. An example could be a hawk eating the snake. Primary producers are autotrophs, such as grass. There are three types of symbiotic relationships. The first is mutualistic, which is when both organisms benefit. Bees and flowers have a mutualistic relationship. Bees get the nectar they need to make honey by traveling between flowers. The bee brings pollen from one plant to another, resulting in pollination. The second type of symbiotic relationship is commensalistic, which is when one organism benefits and the other remains unaffected. The cattle egret forages into pastures and fields among livestock, such as cattle and horses, feeding on the insects stirred up by the movement of the grazing animals. The egrets benefit from the arrangement, but generally speaking, the livestock do not. The third is parasitic, which is when one organism benefits while the other is harmed. Fleas or ticks that live on dogs and cats are parasites. They are living off the blood of the host animal. You need to be familiar with GPP and NPP. Primary productivity is the rate at which energy is converted by photosynthetic and chemosynthetic autotrophs to organic substances. The total amount of productivity in a region or system is gross primary productivity, or GPP. GPP is the amount of energy converted to chemical energy by photosynthesis per unit of time. NPP, which is net primary productivity, is GPP minus the amount of energy used by producers for their own respiration. Tropical rainforests contribute the most to global NPP. As you might guess, the number is shrinking as we cut down these forests. And finally, we have mortality curves. There's three types of mortality curves. Type 1 is mammals, who have a much higher mortality rate in old age. Type 2 are reptiles, which have a constant mortality rate over their lifetime. And type 3 are clams and oysters, who have a high mortality rate when they are young.